Hi, I'm Jo, and I'm the Creative Director at Take Two. And I'd like to acknowledge the Gundungurra people, who are the traditional owners of the land where I'm recording from. Also, a gentle note. In this episode of our Friday Feature Artists series, we'll touch on topics like slavery and suicide. So please watch or listen with care. But first, quilts. What comes to mind? You're probably thinking of something soft, patterned, pieced, maybe passed down through generations. Now imagine that quilt in rich, saturated colour with a large pencil-drawn image attached to the surface. Imagine the image is of a young girl, eyes wide, wearing bright red shoes. She's standing on a gold step, but look again, that step is actually an auction block. These are the kinds of visual narratives Beverly Smith stitches. Her quilts are layered with memory and meaning, drawing you in with beauty, then asking you to stay and consider what lies beneath. We're honoured to share this conversation with Beverly on Juneteenth, a day of reflection, remembrance, and the enduring power of Black storytelling. If you enjoy this episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or leave us a review. Let's dive into this rich conversation with textile artist Beverly Smith. Hello, Beverly. How are you today?
Hello. How are you?
I'm good. It's so
Good.
nice to see you. What time is it there for you at the moment?
I'm thinking it's maybe 6:30.
Yep.
Yeah.
In
So
the
we still have a
evening.
little daylight.
Yeah. And
Mhm.
you're coming into the hot weather as well. We're at opposite ends of the world. I'm south of Sydney, and opposite ends of the season as well. It's starting to get pretty cold.
Really, I never
Yeah.
thought of the temperatures getting cold there.
Yeah. No, we're going right, well, just at the beginning of winter now, and it's the
Wow.
morning for me, so we really are at
Yeah.
the opposite end.
I
Um,
see how hot it gets during the tennis matches, and I just thought it was like hot like that all year round.
yeah. No, it depends on where you are in Australia. Up north, it's certainly more of a tropical climate where
Okay.
I am, and then further south, we definitely have our seasons. Not like the extreme ends of the US or Canada,
Right.
but yeah, no, where I live, we certainly see the seasons, and it gets nice and chilly.
I plan to visit eventually, so I'll
Oh, you
find out.
should. Thank you so much to be joining us today. I'm just thrilled to chat and for us to connect about all things creativity and stitching. We're broadcasting via video, and we'll also be dropping this episode as a podcast. So I highly recommend for our listeners to make sure you take a look at the show notes. The link will be in the description. It will have a lot of the images of the fantastic quilts that we'll be discussing today. What's your day looked like so far, Beverly? What have you been doing or working on?
I have been trying to tie up loose ends with
Mm-hmm.
quilts for the Festival of Quilts in the UK,
Yeah.
and weighing boxes and getting the measurements and the sizes in.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah. So
I'm getting closer.
that's promising if we're at the boxing up stage.
Yes, I think so. Because I have
And
two boxes and yeah.
yeah,
And I hope to have everything shipped off the last of June. I
yeah,
like to work really early, being that they're traveling so far.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's very exciting. You've got an exhibition at the Festival of Quilts,
Yes.
and do you want to explain a little bit of what that involves and what your exhibition will look like?
Well, they sent me this beautiful markup of what all of my quilts will look like. I sent them my quilts and the sizes, and then they do a digital layout so I can see how everything looks, and it's really beautiful. And I plan to head out maybe a day or two earlier before setup.
Mm-hmm.
I also will do a lecture while I'm there. I think it's going to be on a Sunday. The festival starts July 31st. I
Mm-hmm.
think it ends August 3rd or 4th. But on that last day, I will share some of my work and do a presentation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So, yeah, so I'm just, and I have two new quilts, maybe three that I have never exhibited before. So I'm excited about that. But I
Mm-hmm.
really love meeting all the people.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
the beauty of the whole festival, how the people come through, the quilters, we start sharing stories. I started learning so much from other quilters.
Yeah. So that's at the end of July and it's in Birmingham if people
Yes,
haven't heard about the Festival of Quilts, Birmingham in the UK. So
yes.
that sounds really great and really exciting. And hopefully I will see you there.
Hoping so. I'll try to take a break and move around.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'll do that because,
Yeah.
oh, just the unbelievable amount of different types of quilts to see and
Yeah.
different techniques. That's where I get
Yeah.
inspired as well.
So
Mhm.
much to look at. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Beverly, for those who are unfamiliar with your work and perhaps not quilters, or those who are listening via the podcast and won't be able to see some of the images immediately, I would love you to describe what your quilts look like and what they feel like for our audience.
Well, I'll start with how I was first introduced with quilts. And that was through my grandmother that lived in Blacksburg, South Carolina. And she would make quilts out of anything she could get her hands on. And so my quilts emulate that. I like the feel of having that Southern quilting style. So my quilts can sometimes be a little heavy, even though I have the three layers, the top, the middle, and the backing.
Mm-hmm.
But because of the different fabrics that I use, some very vintage, some I quilt myself, old garments, anything like my grandmother would do. And sometimes even the stuffing. The stuffing makes a quilt really thick because she used traditional batting. Most of the time I'll use traditional batting, but
Mm-hmm.
also I will stuff it with secret things because my grandmother would do that. I don't think she did that intentionally, but if she grabbed up an old shirt, it would go in there.
Yeah.
So I started like taking quilt patterns that my mother used when I was a little girl to make my play outfits. And I will stuff those in my quilt with my batting.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of texture, a lot of breaking of needles. That's why I will do some machine and then I will do some hand stitching, which I really love, right? Slowing it
Mhm.
down and getting
Yeah.
in touch with the fabric and all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Wonderful. We have an image of your
Yeah.
grandmother,
You can say grandmom. I like how you had,
grandmom.
and she's in a cotton field, even though this is actually like the 1920s.
Mhm.
And but my ancestors still remained on farms, did farming, and
Mhm.
still picked cotton as part of their living, even years after enslavement. But that's my grandma Ada, and I used to visit her in Blacksburg, South Carolina. That's a little town in the States, in the southern part of the States. But I would sleep in this little room that she had right off her kitchen, right?
Mm.
And she would, and it was really hard for me to spend the night with anyone. My parents used to try to break me out of always wanting to be home, but I had no problems with my grandmother sleeping in that room by myself.
Yeah.
She would put that heavy quilt on top of me, and it would like have me stationary. It seemed like I stayed like that the night, but it was really heavy on my little body. I remember, and I remember it had all of these colors, and
Yeah.
I also can remember it had like this stuffing coming out of it a little bit. So it was warm. But I can tell you, I never picked at that stuffing, and besides, I was like confined with my.
He couldn't move. He couldn't move.
I could move. But when I wake up that morning, I would be refreshed. I would be ready to go out and play. And I can remember staying like weeks with my grandmother.
Yeah.
But it was her quilting that really made an impact on me. But it wasn't until I went to school and started having classes in textiles that I started actually remembering the quilting style. And I went into that. I did more research and I found out like my grandmother's, all those colors she used were really patchwork quilts that didn't really have a rhyme or reason, but they did have all these bright colors. And my textile classes alerted me that this is something that came from Africa. When you look at the kente cloth, the mixing and matching of fabric, not in any particular pattern, but taking on what they call offbeat phrasing. And it's a way of rearranging your patchwork where it meanders and goes all over the place like jazz music. And then with further study, I realized that like my Aunt Sarah, my aunts, and some of my elders, that this was like by design, the patchwork that moved all over the place in no particular pattern, because they believed that spirits could work their way into inanimate objects. Now, I don't know how true that is, but they were in the belief that if you have these patterns offbeat, mixed up, that it made it more difficult for certain spirits to move throughout your quilting. And like I said, even though I don't know if I truly believe in that, but I never take a chance. So you will notice that all of my quilts contain that patchwork design.
Well, even that's a fabulous idea, isn't it? But even the fact that as a child, you got so much comfort from the quilt, and that comfort was related to the weight of the quilt, and the weight of the quilt is related to the idea that it's pieced and there's lots of fabric and connections, and that all adds to the sandwich, doesn't it? Like the top gets heavier. If you're putting things in the middle, it gets heavier. So there's, even in a sort of loose sense, the fact that you got so much comfort from the object of the quilt, whether or not it was blocking the spirits out, that's what helped you get to sleep.
And I had no idea about that until my later years, like sitting around with my Aunt Sarah. But at the time when I was with my grandmother, I had no idea about that. Yeah. And so I'm glad, because I may have been frightened, but maybe that's why I slept so well, right?
Well, they now sell weighted blankets, don't they? I know my daughter really likes to have that feeling of weight on her when to feel comfortable. Was it your grandmother Ada who taught you to quilt, or was it a big combination of people and your aunts and your sort of own study? How did you learn to quilt?
It was a combination. And my mother used to do a lot of sewing as well. But it was a combination of me growing up small, knowing how to thread a needle, how to pull the needle through, how to tie the knot at the end. And I never made like a quilt when I was really small with my grandmother, but I did used to mend my doll clothes and make some doll clothes for myself. So I learned how to sew during that time. But it was actually when I started on my second degree. My first degree was in psychology, and then that second bachelor's degree was in art education, and that's when
Right.
I actually started taking textile classes and practicing sewing under my instructor, then making quilts. I have to tell you, Joe,
Yeah.
when I was in my textile classes in college and I made my first quilt, and I will tell you it was a mess, but my instructor put it in a art contest for students that were all a part of North Carolina colleges. And I got first place. And that's when I realized, oh, I can do what I love, honor my grandmother, and make quilts. That was my first inspiration.
Oh, wow.
Second inspiration.
Yeah.
My first was my grandmother.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's keep talking about honoring family a little bit.
Yes.
And I know you're interested in genealogy.
Yes.
So I have a couple of photos here of family. So can you describe who the people in this photo are?
Yes, those are some of my great great cousins from the late 1800s. I'm thinking
Mhm.
early 1900s. And that comes from my family's photos.
Mhm.
And their last name was Moss. But I am so grateful that my family took a lot of photos very early on. And that's how I am inspired and get a lot of my portraits from the photographs.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I've got another one here.
And then this one here, that has to do with my family. One of the young boys, Isaiah, in that family, he was a minister at a church where I had a studio. But the young girl that's sitting on the mother's lap, she's the only girl in the family, even though some of the guys look like they have on dresses. Back in those days, some of the young boys would wear like these long garments
Mhm.
like dresses. But the young lady sitting on the lap, the only girl in that family, her mother is Mary. That's like my third aunt removed. She was born enslaved. And
Mhm.
she is the sister of my third grandmother removed, Nancy Meacham.
Right.
Yes, they were both born like maybe 1860s, very close to the time where enslavement was ending.
Mm.
They were still very young when they
Yeah.
once were freed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a question came in from Cindy, and Cindy asked Beverly, she said, Beverly, these are so beautiful. I could stare for hours at the details, and I'm curious about who inspires you. And
Okay.
I've popped
Thank
that
you,
question.
Cindy.
Yeah,
I
thank you,
appreciate that
Cindy.
question. I really do.
Because I think from this image of the family and your great uncle Israel, there's a connection to one of your quilts. And I thought this
Yes.
might be a really lovely way to answer Cindy's
Yes.
question.
Yes.
Should I show the church quilt?
Yes. Yes. Please
Yeah.
do. This is the Grace Church, and it's still standing in a neighborhood that was historically Black. I mean, my ancestors, once they were freed, they were some of the first freed enslaved people to come to this area in Charlotte, known as Brooklyn. And all of the buildings are missing now in that area, except for that Grace Church that's there with two other original buildings. But Brooklyn was in an area in Charlotte, North Carolina, in the States, where nobody really wanted to live. I mean, it was low country, and all of the waste from all the other cities would flow down into that area. But when you think about enslaved people being free for the first time and having an area to call their own, it was still excitement.
Mm.
They developed their own churches, schools, newspapers, flower shops. It became a place like the first Black Wall Street during that time.
Wow.
But the church that's still there, the Grace Church, there's a gentleman that owned the 3 buildings that are left there. And he invited me to have a studio at the church. And while I was having a tour there, I was like getting really lightheaded, and I was really trying to be polite because I was really excited to have a studio. I had just retired from teaching, and I was doing most of my work, my own work, in the classroom or in a little corner of my bedroom. So when he offered me this space with the really high ceilings and the stained glass windows, oh, I was so excited, but I was still feeling a little lightheaded, and I did have to excuse myself. I had to come home and just get in the bed and rest. And then I started my research, which is always a very important part of my work. And when I was little, my family used to always say, you know, you had a cousin that died in the pulpit. And I was like trying to imagine that as a child. And I was trying to think, well, which way did he fall? What did the people do? What did they say? It was the most foreign to me. And even when I would come home from college, I still had relatives saying, you know, you had a cousin that died in the pulpit. And so once I started doing my research, it was unbelievable that now where I have my studio set up, that was where my uncle Israel Jackson had his sermon and had passed away, I think around noon, right there while he was giving his sermon.
Wow.
And and his sermon was about how to prepare yourself for your last days of living on the earth.
Yeah.
And some of my family that I researched that attended that church, they were that remembered when he did this. This was in like the 1940s when this happened. They were saying how there was a train that used to go by the church at a certain time right during the sermon every Sunday. And yet this Sunday, this is what people were saying, it was so quiet.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, when that took place. But I loved working in the church. I had absolutely.
I've put a little video of you working in the church.
Yes,
So feel free. I'll play it. It doesn't have sound. So feel free to talk over the top and just explain that experience.
So I can open up all my quilts, which was really a wonderful thing for me because I collect a lot of vintage quilts, but sometimes I forget what I have when they're all packed away. But I could open them up and walk among them, feel the vibe. And then at a certain time of the evening, the stained glass windows would light, cast this array of colors all over the quilt. So it was a beautiful experience for me. Now here you are seeing where I am part of my process on how I create my portraits when I'm drawing them. And I really do prefer drawing from live subjects. I use my sisters, nieces, nephews, cousins. When I can't find a photograph, a black and white photograph, I love using my siblings. And what I found is that DNA, that trait, those characteristics, some of them go all the way back to when my ancestors were enslaved on the Blaylock plantation. That comes from my research as well. So Research is very important to me, but I will tell you the best stories come from listening to the elders in my family. And that was something that was very big in my family, sitting on my grandma's porch, all the uncles and aunts telling stories. And they would mention information that would help me to be able to decide what my portrait would say and what kind of portrait would appear on my quilt.
Mm.
So the portraits that you saw me rendering live people, I prefer that, my siblings, but also I will go to my family's photo album and I would get black and white pictures and draw from those.
I can show those finished quilts that relate to the drawings that you were just doing of your sisters.
Right. Yes.
And here's another one. And I have a question actually that came in from Anna about sisters. So I might play that now and see what you have to say.
Okay.
Hi Beverly, it's Anna from Australia. I wanted to ask you about the figures in your quilts, and they often represent people of deep personal importance to you.
Yes.
What is it like to see their likeness take shape through the layers of fabric and stitch and memory? And also, I'm wondering, how do your sisters and close friends respond when they see themselves in your work? Thanks.
Those are so good. Well, thank you, Hannah. Yes, my sisters love it. They always say, wow, it looks like I'm jumping off the quilt. When they say that, I know I've rendered them pretty well. Now, my sister, Carolyn, this one here that I'm doing of her uppity, she has an attitude, but she doesn't see, but she doesn't believe she has an attitude. But she loves the uppities. I've done several series of them. And you can see I'm putting the ruff on. And I love going in. I start off on canvas, everyone. That's a technique I developed when I was in graduate school. I had to complete an advanced drawing class, and one was not offered at that time. So they placed me in an advanced MFA painting class. And the students received yards of canvas. That was part of their studio equipment. And I received that as well. And so I was like, okay, I got to use this canvas and fulfill my drawing class, a drawing for advanced class. And so I just started drawing really large on the canvas. And I noticed that as I'm drawing really large, that movement in my hand and doing those gesture drawings, it became another language for me. Mm-hmm. So I had been doing quilting, but I was doing more applique with fabric until I took this class in graduate school. And it became like my signature that I use to this day, drawing these really large figures on canvas. And also canvas is great. You can sew through it. So it was part of my technique. And when you look at this uppity with her leggings on, the royal blue, dark blue pants on, and the ruff around her collar, which is really from the Elizabethan era, which was kind of like a status to have that collar. And so I just loved placing it on uppity. Uppity is a term from the South in America that they would give to Blacks that felt like they didn't know their station. And so in my quilting and with my portraits, I love how I can rewrite my own story. So putting that ruff around uppity gave her a sense of status, and also that hand gesture and side eye. It's like you have nothing on me. That's the way her hand is doing. And then that pie in her hand, it symbolizes that saying, the blacker the berry, which is part of this title, uppity, the blacker the berry. But it was another part of that title too, the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. And if you've ever picked blackberries, you know that the blacker the berry, how sweet that juice would be. But that's also how my ancestors would take different terms and labels assigned to them, and they would add it where it would put them on a different status, where they take a term and turn it around to something that was positive for them. So it all had to do with like skin tone and how the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. So even the blacker the skin tone, the sweeter the person, the more they had going on inside of them. And that's where that phrase came from. But also in the South, when we would welcome people, a pie was one of those ways to welcome them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's just so many layers in your quilts, and I really must encourage, if you're just listening to this episode, I really must encourage you to jump into the show notes and click the link so that you can see the images of the work that Beverly's talking about. Yes. Because there's so many layers and symbols. And there's also, I think, a lot of girls. And I thought I might show just a little bit of a sequence of some quilts, and you can just describe them and also explain some of the meaning or symbols in these quilts, Beverly. So I'll bring some up on screen now.
Oh. And so I will tell you, I started a series, Last Seen Wearing. And I was inspired, again, by some research that took place at Villanova University from some graduate students. That school, that university is located in Pennsylvania in America. And they did research after the Civil War and found that freed slaves were putting newspaper ads out looking and searching for their loved ones that were missing due to being sold or during the Civil War, not lasting throughout the Civil War. And I started with this series because one night I was working in my studio and I was doing a quilt based on my grandmother that was born on the Blaylock plantation in 1826. And I had a certain kind of epiphany, and it seems like my grandmother was wanting me to find one of her siblings. And it was a twin sister. And it was like, I've never heard of that, even with all the talks of my ancestors and everything. Never did I know that my grandmother, born in 1826, Mariah, had a twin. So part of my research also is to talk to relatives that lived before me or are a little older than me. And they confirmed that there was a twin, Minerva. But Minerva was sold when Blaylock passed away. And this quilt that's up now is Minerva in the red boots and the folded vintage patchwork quilt beside her, the folds and the crinkles. And also a commonality in my quilts are these symbols that were said to be a part of quilts during enslavement, during the Underground Railroad. So like the quilt you see behind me, this is known as the bow tie. Also in that Minerva quilt is a pattern, the bow tie. So that's what I mean when I talk about symbols hidden in quilts. And the bow tie would be symbolic for dress up, go to a church. This is how people would get their information when it was time to escape from plantations. And it was very secretive. So I have to tell you, a lot of historians say that they don't have enough information to really say that these symbols were hidden in the quilts. But I also share a book with you, Hidden in Plain View, where the author of, yes, Hidden in Plain View, A Secret Story of Quilts, the author interviewed descendants of parents and grandparents that talked about how they would hide these codes into the quilt and hang them out for everybody to see, but not everybody knew what the message was.
Mm.
So in all of my quilts, I love having these vintage symbols, bow ties, the drunkard's path. Some of these quilts patterns you may know from your own ancestry. They've been around forever, but they just took on different meanings during the Underground Railroad to help people to be able to get messages and prepare themselves for a safe
Mm.
journey to the north.
It
And
makes
even
sense, doesn't
yes,
it?
it makes sense to me. I
Mm.
really believe in that. Just like when my ancestors that were enslaved and they may see another slave, they may break out in song. But that song would have hidden messages as well. But only the person singing and to the enslaved person would know what that message was. So
Mm.
there were different ways to get secrets and codes transferred to the people that needed to hear them. And this is nothing new. Women have used secret codes in crocheting and played a major part in wars and revolutions since the
Yeah,
beginning of time.
yeah. I mean, in from the very biggest of pictures, that's what art can do.
Yes,
Send messages in
absolutely.
subtle or really overt ways. So, of
Yes,
course, it makes total sense that humans will be okay. Now I need to say something quite specific,
yes,
very serious, and if
yes.
I'm not able to call out to people for help or send messages about safety, I'll
Hmm.
find another way.
Yes,
It's
absolutely.
incredible. Mm,
Absolutely. So people, they will find a way.
yeah.
And it's the same for us to this day. You can't really quiet people or shut people down. And I
Mm,
think about, but it was always dismissed as women's work. And
yeah.
so a lot of attention wasn't given to it. But I think that's the best part about it. That's how those secret codes and things could be laced into a pattern, crocheted into a pattern, or quilted into a pattern. Mhm.
Yeah. I have a question. Well, I have lots of questions, Beverly,
Yes.
but I do have a question from Joe, a different Joe to
Okay.
me. And I'll just play that one now and we'll see what you think.
Okay.
Hi, Beverly. Thanks for sharing your work and your talent with us all. I'm Jo from Australia. My question is around whether, for you, communicating messaging or making came first. And I know it's a very chicken and egg kind of question. So I'm interested in how the desire to tell a story becomes a creative pursuit for some people, and for other people, they either don't tell their story or they use a different vocation to do that work
Mhm.
in a different way. So,
Yeah.
how's that for you?
Okay, Joe, that was a wonderful question. And I will have to say that it depends what comes first. Is it my story or is it in the process once I start quilting? And I would have to say that it's the story that kind of comes first for me. And I think it has to do with my training in graduate school, okay? Because I was so encouraged, to use a sketchbook and sketch things out. And having an idea in my head was very important. The idea, then transferring it to the sketchbook. But usually it's the story. And then, like, Lasting Wearing, that series I had, I mean, I was rendering my grandmother really large gesture drawings, new language coming out. And it baffled me so much. Then comes my research, okay, and my interviews with other family members. And then it starts to all come together. And then I come back to the studio and I start with my story. And I do believe that all artists and all quilters, even when they are traditional quilts that are just done with the patchworks or other designs, there's always that story in there. My grandmother taught me that the smallest piece of fabric can hold generations of stories. And just because I have like a representational image of my relatives sometimes in the quilt, it's those little patterns that tell a story every time. That's why I love collecting vintage quilts, especially like the 1930s, where they're using the feed sacks to create the patterns. Okay. That is a story within myself. Like in America in the 1940s and 30s, we had a Great Depression. America was suffering with money, and the South felt it heavily. And my mother was growing up in the South at that time. So her stories, I would add when she would tell me how they would wear feed sacks and flour sacks as clothing and garments because they didn't have money to go to the store and buy real garments. That right there, that fabric would tell a story and how people lived during that time and how people would make makeshift to make things happen. So I feel that even when you're looking at a traditional quilt, every little piece of fabric has that story behind it. Yeah.
I'm just looking for one of the images that has some of the ideas. I'm not sure if these are feed sacks, but there's certainly that idea of repurposed fabrics being used to make clothes. And in that visualization, you're telling an immediate story.
Yes.
And I also remember you telling me something about the red shoes. Is there a story behind the red shoes, Beverly?
Right. So we're looking at a series of quilts that have red shoes. That's a commonality in my quilts again. And that comes from my grandmother, Cassie, that was born in 1789. And she was purchasing some shoes, doing my research. I found ledgers where she was shopping at a store in 1835 at the McGill store. And if you can imagine, in 1835, slavery was still going on in the South. So most African Americans were enslaved. I mean, you were limited to what you could do. You certainly couldn't go and buy a pair of red shoes. So when I did the research and found my grandmother, Cassie, born in 1789, but in 1835 at a store, purchasing a pair of red shoes, it just blew my mind. These are the ledgers. So you can see Cassie Meacham and all what she was purchasing, buttons, and one shows the red shoes for $1, and it looks like maybe 37 cents.
So we're looking at some original shopping lists from
the
1800s.
And everything written in hand. And you know that family, the McGills, they still have a store on the corner of where my grandmother used to shop. And so when you go in there, they have all of this old memorabilia from their great-great-grandparents' original store. So yeah, that blew my mind that my grandmother was shopping for red shoes. So in honor of her, if they show shoes, they have on red shoes. So that's what that is about. And this is called The Bond That Binds. And these little girls, they have on original flour sacks. And I will tell you, I had someone from Australia send me some flour sacks and they're part of that quilt that you see,
Oh,
Borough.
really?
Yeah, flower company.
Wow. Hang on a
Yeah,
minute. I've got to look back at it.
that's before you guys invited me. And I'm like, see how things work?
Yeah. It's funny. It's funny how things work.
Right.
Um, the echo of history and this incredibly complex and painful legacy of slavery.
Mhm.
Do you know much about your ancestry and their experiences?
Well, I don't have direct experiences from being on the plantation. But because of my research, and I can see how many of my relatives were on the Blaylock plantation, I know most of them were kept intact, except for Minerva, the other twin. She was separated from my grandmother that was on the plantation. I think they were 8 years old when they were separated. And I do have the original sale receipt where Minerva was sold for $250 to a woman. I can't remember her name right now, but I do have those original documents. But I will tell you that I knew that my family, like many enslaved people at that time, were separated and sold.
Yeah.
But I never really understood that pain until I got that message from my grandmother, Mariah, about her sister, Minerva. And I could see why it's like she would want to know what happened to her sister. Can you find her? And also, one of the other quotes you showed of my sister, it was titled Evangeline. That is that name, what we're looking at now. And she has on these red polka dot boots, right? And she's standing on like this gold step, which symbolizes an auction block for me. And she's dressed in all of these vintage flour sacks, which I collect a lot of flour sacks too. But Evangeline is a name that was also on the Blaylock plantation, but it's also the name of my oldest sister. So that's how I was able to track down information as well, because some of the names were just passed down over and over again. And my sister Evangeline, talking about the separation, and for the first time, I really felt that pain. My sister Evangeline took her life on my birthday, January the 17th. It's been over a decade. But when I was doing Evangeline's quilt, oh, I cried. And it took me a very long time to complete that quilt. I would have to stop and come back and stop and come back. But what I realized is I had not fully dealt with my sister's passing. But quilting for me is so therapeutic.
Yeah.
And it helps me to, understand enslavement better and to deal with those emotions. And like I said, it has helped me to deal with issues in my own personal life to this day.
Yeah.
So we talked about machine sewing versus hand sewing. And when I am hand sewing, I am really connected to the fabrics and it slows me down.
Yeah.
I have to pull through the layers and I have to take my time doing the running stitch, the blind stitch.
Yeah.
After a while, I'm not even thinking about the stitches. I go into a rhythm.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you know how your mind can just travel when you're hand stitching. So yeah, that's what I love about quilting. It's
I
very
often feel too when I'm stitching that a connection to women in the past.
Mhm.
And this is something that, well, and men, but women by far in the majority
Right.
for, you know, an incredible amount of generations have stitched fabric,
Yes.
and that slowness and the connection of materials, there's
Mhm.
something about that.
Yes.
I think when I look at your, well, firstly, I'm so sorry for your loss.
Yes. Thank you.
And when I see your quilts, I guess, you know, I'm middle-aged white woman living in Australia, right? So my connection to slavery couldn't be more distant, and this is really, or my understanding of slavery couldn't be more distant.
Yes.
But this connection we're having here in this conversation, but also your quilts,
Yes.
do something about bringing that understanding right here and now in front of the viewer. That
Yes.
when you're looking at an image of a girl and standing on an auction block,
Yes.
you know, with the feed sack reference and the traditional quilting reference,
Mhm.
it's a way to make this huge topic that
Yeah.
is quite hard to understand
Mhm.
much more understandable. So I want to say thank you to that.
Well,
Thank
thank you.
you to you for that, because I think that's the power of art right there, is understanding or looking at a topic differently, or taking a moment to be mindful with a topic.
Yes.
And I have a question that relates to this, and I think it connects a little bit to how you're talking about this incredibly big topic of ancestry, intergenerational trauma, slavery,
Yes.
and also your own personal experiences of
Right.
family. So I have a simple question from Anna that I'll play now.
Okay.
Hi, it's Anna from Adelaide here. How do you know, Beverly, when a story is ready to be told? Is it just a feeling or something else?
Well, I'll tell you, Anna, initially, um, I was a little embarrassed and apprehensive about really going into that aspect of my family's history. And so my earlier quilts depicted, oh, maybe me getting my hair done. That was one of my first quilts that won that first place in the quilting contest. Me sitting around the dinner table with all of my family members. But then, as I kept working with quilting and everything, and began to like tell my stories going through the photographs, discovering my ancestors that were on the Blaylock plantation, having that epiphany with my grandmother Mariah, I knew that I had to say their names. And I will tell you that ever since I started creating that series and saying their names, it's like I've been walking this earth differently ever since. So um, I'm trying not to get too far away from your question, Anna. It was a very good one. But it was very difficult for me initially to like bring those stories in. And I taught school for 30 years. I retired from teaching art. And I would encourage my students, even high school students, that embrace your story, whatever it is, be open about it, be willing to share it. And it comes at different times for different people. But those stories that you hid underneath, that you felt ashamed of, those are the stories that will set you free. And then you help out so many other people because we're all connected And in one way or another, we have gone through some trials and tribulations that people can relate.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I did have to come to an understanding of myself before I was able to tell those stories. And I wanted to make sure that they were accurate. So that's where the research comes in. I have a lot of relatives and they're stickler for dates, names, and locations. They will call you out. So
Yeah.
I had to make sure that my dates were accurate, or I just get wrapped up in the whole emotional part of it. And also, I have to say that it was a relative that came knocking on my door looking for some obituaries. I don't know if you have obituaries that go with the people that pass away in Australia,
Yeah. Yep.
but as a little person, I did not like obituaries. They were scary to me. And my mother collected them, lots of them, right? And put them in the photo album as well.
Mm.
It was that cousin that came to me and knocked on that door wanting those obituaries that enlightened me all that history, dates, how far back you can go. That's a really good source of information. Graveyards are an excellent source of information. So yeah, once I started discovering myself. So once I started doing that research and finding out about my grandmother Cassie shopping for the red shoes, it does something to you in the inside when you realize that you're not just a person that just came from off the bottom of a ship, or you're not a person that just grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina. That my history goes back really far and they're real
Yeah.
people that walk the earth just like myself. So then that's when the bravery comes in for me, that I'm not walking this journey alone, but all my ancestors are behind me, rooting me on. And I mean that seriously because they all started like wanting me to say their names. I couldn't keep up. I want my name said. I want my name on this. And
You're
so
like,
that's
shush up, Minerva, shush up, Evangeline.
when you'll start seeing quilts that have multiple images in them because I'm trying to get all the names in there that were on the plantation. And most people that do research and they find their plantations where their ancestors were, they won't say names. They categorize them according to gender and age, right? And it's a long range of ages. But through my research, I was able to find all of their names listed.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So I started putting them in my quilts.
So when you're doing your work and your history and then making your quilts, it's a personal process for you. That's what I'm picking up. You're telling stories about individuals.
Right.
You're connecting those to yourself and your own experiences of family.
Yes.
And I know that one of your quilts is actually now in the Smithsonian.
Yes.
Are you conscious of that you're preserving history and you're sort of making sure that this the Black stories and history remains told, and are you sort of conscious of that bigger picture that you're contributing to something, or is it really just about the stories you want to tell and all of that is a bonus? Or well, I'm wondering what your feelings are about that sort of side.
That was a good question too, because actually that is the icing on the cake, the cherry on top. Because I'm actually into the quilt, I'm into the process, I'm into the story, and it can be very emotional. And it can shut me down for days because, like, once I found out about the twin, Minerva, I found her gravesite, and it was an actual slave gravesite. I have grave sites that I can actually go to and find relatives and do rubbings and everything. But I had never actually been to a slave gravesite. where they have just the markings of little rocks all over the place indicating the graves, because back then you weren't allowed to show that you could read or write. And also it had to be a very discreet, you burying your family members. And so when I found Minerva's gravesite and I'm walking among all these stones and my feet sinking into the ground, that was a new sensation for me. I had to close down for a while, take to my bed again, and it took days for me to gather. So while all of this is going on in my process, I'm not really thinking about preserving the history, but I am very appreciative and very honored that the Smithsonian has the quilt Too Much Sugar for a Dime. And that's what we're looking at right here on this screen. And so what I have behind this figure is a little girl. I base it off of one of my nieces, Thea. That's where the rendering comes from. But behind her is a patchwork, like what my grandmother used to work with. But it symbolizes a board game I used to love to play as a little girl, Candyland. I don't know if you're familiar with Candyland, but the objective was to maneuver yourself throughout the game board till you get to the very top of the quilt where you reach your home. But in between all that movement, you step into different places like candy, chocolate covered strawberries, cotton candy. I took a lot of those terms and I related them back to my history again. Like there's an ice cream in the corner known as a mule, and it's a candy bar with a stick that in the 1800s, it was kind of like one of the first time they had ice cream frozen on a stick. And they used to call it the mule because of how they would use a mule to help churn the ice and make the ice cream. But I took that term and I did the 40 acres and a mule. And that's part of American Southern history after the Civil War, and they freed the slaves. They promised slaves 40 acres and a mule, which was never really followed through. But those are the kinds of images I have behind the figure. And a lot of her dress is made with embroidery, hand stitches to make it look like little bits of candy. But that whole title, Too Much Sugar for a Dime, my mother used to say that when I was little all the time. And I'm like, what does that even mean? Yeah. And we would be out at a restaurant and she would go back and forth with the waiter about the price of a hot dog. And it would be, that's too much sugar for a dime. Okay. So then I realized it's something too good to be true. But she got that phrase from her grandmother that raised her in Barnwell, South Carolina, during the Great Depression when they would wear all the feed sacks. And sugar was very expensive during the Great Depression. I mean, people would use molasses because they couldn't afford sugar. So that whole phrase of too much sugar for a dime, nowadays is equated. Most people don't use it, but it means something too good to be true.
Too good to be true.
Yes. And like those offerings of 40 acres for a mule that never materialize, again, too good to be true.
Yeah. Well, thank you for explaining that work. It's gorgeous, and there's one more that we can show that looks like it's got a 3-dimensional element, Beverly, with the stacks. Are they feed sacks as well?
Yes, and like I said, I would collect feed sacks, even before I knew I was going to use them in my quilts. But I do a lot of thrift stores, flea markets, attic sales. A lot of the quilters here can relate. That's where you get some of the best vintage fabrics. And this garment she's wearing, that's vintage as well. When the slaves first arrived in America, they were restricted to wearing, certain garments. is referred to as the South Carolina Act of 1735, and they would make the slaves wear nothing but these Welsh white plains. Okay, so that's how the Dutch kind of got involved with enslavement in America, because they would make all of these white garments, and it was a lucrative business. Yeah, in the Netherlands. And but what was happening in America is that some of the slaves would get these hand-me-down clothes from their masters, really rich red velvets, satin garments, and they put out the law to keep the slaves from dressing really fancy. But also, I realized that wearing the white garments made you stand out. So it would counteract a lot of the running away in the woods and all.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's so much we could talk about, and so many more layers to unravel. So maybe we'll need to have another chat at some point.
Yes.
I have a question though, to sort of bring us around in a circle, and I guess, is there one thread or one idea that you hope people will carry after they see your quilts, Beverly?
Yes. Well, I'm hoping people will think about their own history and their ancestors, and be curious enough to go down that rabbit hole. Sometimes it can be a rabbit hole, but to pull out that information, that research, because there are so many lessons learned from our ancestors that we can use to this day to help us survive, live comfortably, how to treat others. So that is my hope. And then also doing that research and putting it into your own work, it completes the circle. And it also gives you a sense of feeling wholeness and never alone. So that's what I'm hoping really for of a lot of viewers that get to experience my quilts.
There is something that happens, isn't there, when you hear about a family member, and it might be in a whole lot of different ways, that you think, oh, maybe that's why I am the way I am. It gives us that, like you said so beautifully, it helps us not feel alone.
Yeah,
It's very
yeah.
powerful.
It's that discovery. Yes, sure. And it just changes everything within you. It really does. And I believe that even when our people pass away, that sometimes we have an even closer connection with them than we did when they were alive. So it's possible to still be able to feel that connection. And like you say, oh, that's why I like eating that. Oh, that's why I like those clothes.
Yeah.
And it's just like, you know, an awareness that you are not alone, and you continue. And after you, it will continue on.
Yeah.
So we're ever always evolving.
Yeah. I did have a question that came through, and I feel like I would be remiss not covering it, because I'm sure when people look at your quilts and they see these renderings in graphite or pencil, they have a similar question to Nicola's. So I'll just play this one, and then we might move on to our little Every Artist Must sequence. So I'll play this now.
Hi, Beverly. I'm just curious about what you use to seal your drawings on the fabric. It looks like you use a pencil, and I think if I was to do that, it would probably smudge everywhere. So I'd love to know what you use. Thanks. Bye.
Okay. Excellent question. And I get asked that a lot.
I bet you do.
Initially, when I started with the graphite, and I like really rich B6s and B8s, people that draw know exactly what I'm talking about. But I used to use a fixative because that's what we would use in school. Then when I started working with quilters that were very conscious of their fabrics, I have some quilters that you will never get them in a fabric shop. They will do nothing but thrift stores and repurposing vintage garments, just like my grandmother would use. I switched from the fixative in the can, and I started using a little bit of water and vinegar, and it's safe. And you can do alcohol as well, and it will not smell. I do it outside, but it will fix your graphite. And so you don't have to use harsh chemicals, you know. But also, I discovered a technique where I would wet a cloth, a really clean white cotton cloth, wring out the water really well, and put it over the graphite and iron it, and that sets it as well.
Really?
And yeah, and sometimes it'll take several irons, but that's good because sometimes you want to rework something you see differently once you hang it up and stuff. So that process, you know, of ironing the vinegar and then ironing, it will set it and no problem.
Good to know. Well, Nicola will.
And let me just show this. I use a lot of tracing paper when I draw.
Right.
I have tons and tons of drawing.
Yeah.
And like if this is a photograph,
Yeah.
I will use my tracing paper, and I use a really rich pencil, right? And then the canvas. This is just painting canvas, unprimed. And then I will put my image on it. And when I go over it with my pencil, you know, because I do it both sides, then I have my transfer. And then that's when I start to rework and get the details and everything in. This is when I'm working from a photograph.
Thank you. That's so generous to share your process and the tips and tricks that I'm sure you've developed over many, many, many quilts. So we have our little segment now to wrap up our interview. It's called Every Artist Must. So what I'll do is I will give you a little rapid fire round of questions, and I start the sentence, and then you finish the sentence with whatever comes to mind. It's called Every Artist.
Alrighty.
So are you game, Beverly, for a little bit of...
I am.
Fantastic. Okay, let's go. Every artist must own.
Ooh. Okay. Every artist must own a special pair of clippers. Now, I'm not talking about regular scissors. I'm talking about these little clippers that they like use when you go to get a manicure.
Oh, like snippy things.
Snippies, okay? I mean, because every little thread that you can't get to, even with the smallest pair of shears, those will clip it for you.
Okay, you heard it here first.
Yeah, they're the best, but they look like the little clippers from the when you get a manicure. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Next one. Every artist must create.
Every artist must create from your heart. Be as authentic as you can. That's how your stories are relatable, and other people can understand the story behind yours, because being authentic, even though you might feel like you're isolated, nobody ever did that, they'll think I'm crazy if I put that out there. So many other people feel that same way.
Yeah.
So every artist must create from the heart.
Every artist must avoid.
Okay. Every artist must avoid talking negatively to yourself in the beginning of your process. sometimes we have a tendency to do that.
Mm.
And it'll stop us in our tracks or slow down the process, right? Stay positive, even at the very beginning. Have faith that it will correct itself in the end. So stay away from the negative thoughts, especially in the very beginning of your process.
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
Every artist must learn.
Every artist must learn how to ask your siblings for advice on your artwork. If you go to them, or your husband, your spouse, your friend, and you're not complete, but you say, what do you think about, and you're wanting them to discuss an eye that you put on.
Yeah.
And they start talking about, well, I don't like that color she's wearing. Okay? We'll talk about everything but the eye. You need to know how to, when you ask people for a little advice, tell them, I'm only interested in this part of the eye. Okay? And that extra feedback does help, because some people can see things we can't see when we get all involved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Every artist must remember.
Every artist must remember that you are an intricate part of this world. And you have been given an unbelievable opportunity to be able to share your dreams, your hopes, your thoughts with others from all over. And that it doesn't matter if you're showing in a gallery. It doesn't matter if your quilt is just hanging on the wall for nobody else to really see. That's still such a very special thing that you have been given, that you are allowed to bring out of yourself and into the 3D form.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're very special and very needed. And I love all of you. I do.
We love you, Beverly. Thank you so much. And thank you for, excuse me, thank you for playing along.
I love that.
That brings us.
The questions too.
What's that? What's that?
I love the questions.
Oh,
the questions are my favorite.
I'm so glad. Thank you so much for this chat. I just feel so honored to have had this hour and 15 minutes with you to talk about your story and your work, and your responses were so honest and inspiring. And I would never ask you to educate me, but I really feel like I've learned so much. So thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you from all our listeners. To those who are watching and listening, we've come to the end. Mm-hmm. Thank you for joining us in this conversation with Beverly Smith. Don't forget that we will link to all the images that we talked about, all the beautiful quilts in our show notes and episode description. Uh-huh. But for now, we're going to say goodbye and play our little last video. So thanks again, Beverly.
Thank you. And bye, everyone.
Bye for now.